several people made comments, not my opinion, but two distinguished members of the RMT came to one of our meetings, and they came along to the meeting and said, come to this meeting because we want to be there, we want to speak alongside the greatest union leader in our lifetime. That was their comment. We've had many on Facebook say the same thing. Nelson Mandela made the same comment, and others too. So, I can't refute that. Although some people do. On YouTube, we get one or two comments, and it's one, good old Arthur, he always backs the wrong horse. Well, I don't know about that, but I mean, if you go back and look at the records, when has that happened? From that day, certainly in '72, long before that, but you know, what's changed in terms of that? Consistent in doing things, in standing up for the right horse. And I think one example I'll give of that is when Tony Blair was coronated or crowned or whatever they do in the Labour Party leadership. There was huge ovation, people standing, clapping, cheering, and the cameras moved to figure of two people. It was Dennis Skinner and Arthur Scargill, who remained seated. At the same time, I think it was Tony Blair took out of his pocket or something and made policy on the hoof. Oh, clause, what's this? Clause 4. We don't need that anymore. Toss that out. I said there was still clapping and so on. I met one of the MPs a few years later, though, and their opinion of Tony Blair had changed rather markedly, and I got earache about the way he was carrying on. But anyway, this is the situation now, so I ask you to listen to Arthur Scargill.
48 years ago, I was in Birmingham for the first time in my life. I had received a telephone call as the strike organiser in Yorkshire and the spokesman for the strike committee on a Saturday afternoon, asking if I would arrange hundreds of pickets and go to Birmingham to picket a coke depot. Couldn't understand it. A coke depot, to my experience, was a small depot with a few hundred tons of coke. But we did as we were requested. We sent, on that same day, within 3 hours, hundreds of Yorkshire minor pickets into Birmingham. I was driving with colleagues in a car. Didn't even know where Birmingham was. And when you get to Spaghetti Junction, it gets even more complicated. But I thought, I'll ask someone. Because I saw this congregation of trucks. I thought, there's got to be a driver. I was surprised to see a person in a police outfit. Always ask a policeman. I suddenly realised there were hundreds of policemen, all in wagons. And I said, could you tell me where the Star Social Club is? Now the Star Social Club was the Communist Party headquarters. The answer I got was interesting. I haven't got a clue, he said. They come from Glamorgan. I don't know what I'm doing here either. I soon found out. For the previous few days, a handful of pickets in the Midlands area had sought to persuade people not to go in and collect coke for industrial purposes from a coke depot in Birmingham. On arrival, we went to the social club. The first people I met was a man and a woman. Frank Waters, who had been a tutor of mine in the political sense, and Maura Simmons, Secretary of the Labour Party in Birmingham. And I said, we've got a problem. We've got hundreds of pickets, but they don't know where they're going to stay. And Frank said, don't worry, we'll sort it. We've done a range of them. And within the next 5 hours, members of the trade union movement and the wider community, particularly the Indian community, came into both the Star Social Club and the Labour Club. Can we have a miner? And throughout the next 5 days, they not only gave them a home, food, comfort, support, but in the majority of cases, they joined them on the picket line. We had young students, youngsters who previous generations said would never react in a way that their forebears had done in 1926. But here they were, acting on the picket line to defend their jobs and to fight for a decent increase in pay. Not only did we receive their support, but we received over the next few days an example of what class issues are all about. The first thing that we did was on the Sunday morning, after 2 hours sleep, we went down to the picket line. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. Imagine a miniature Mount Everest of coke. I learned that there were 700 lorries per day had been going into that plant and taking coke for industrial purposes at a time when we had old age pensioners starving in the cold. I thought, this has got to stop. On that Sunday morning, we stopped all production at the Saltley Coke Works, often forgotten in the history of what really happened in Birmingham in 1972. What did we do? We stepped up the number of pickets because they were warned by me that the police would come back in even greater numbers than we'd seen on the Sunday. And boy, did they do that. We encountered a police force that was prepared to do anything and everything to stop workers seeking to prevent scab lorry drivers taking coke away in an attempt to undermine the miners' dispute. For the next few days, battles took place on that picket line. Irrespective of all the stories that we've heard, I can tell you from experience that people were being beaten, people were being arrested, including me, only to be released as a result of hundreds of pickets surrounding the police station and demanding my release. And the police did. They showed a bit of common sense, but more was to come. I knew that the only way that we could achieve anything was to get support. Miners alone couldn't do it. I'd been preaching as a young man that class solidarity is what we need in the movement. So we began a series of meetings, as you've heard from previous speakers who have eloquently explained, together with Banner Theatre, what the situation was like. Meeting after meeting with union after union, from the transport and general workers on one side, the engineering sections on the other, the students, trades councils. I met them all and said in simple terms, we're asking for your support. I am not asking for contributions of pound notes or £5 notes. We want industrial support, and that means striking in support of miners who have been battered on a picket line, which was being seen every night on television. The major meeting that took place, the final meeting in the bullring, there were hundreds there. The question was put: support for miners is support for yourselves. Our fight is your fight. If they succeed against the miners, they will begin to fight against you. And the resolution was put by a man called Arthur Harper. And he said, you've heard what Brother Scargill has said. I'm asking all of you to come out on strike on the 10th of February. The full-time area secretary was there, and we may well say it. He stood up and said, well, I've listened to Brother Scargill and I agree with him, but we can't possibly do it by Thursday. I'm proposing, like, in the interest of unity, that we could do it by the week after. And I said to Arthur Harper, too late. It's got to be a Thursday, 2 days' time. If it isn't, the tide will turn. He said, right, brothers, we're discussing Brother Scargill's motion. All those in favour, and he'd warned me. There was one man in that audience who consistently had opposed industrial action when they had previously been involved. He says, and I tell you, he will be the annoying fly in the ointment. He'll inevitably stand on his feet and put forward some reason why we shouldn't take action. And so I braced myself for the inevitability of an attack or a case against. And duly he stood up. He said, "Can I ask you a question, Brother Scargill?" And I looked hard and I said, "Yes." He said, "What time do you want us there?" Half an hour was completely thrown. And afterwards I went to him and I said, "Thank you for that." He says, "No problem. My four brothers are all miners and are all on a strike." So you see, there are issues and situations where you can call upon members of your own class to support you. And that day, the 10th of February 1972, the people, the workers of Birmingham, wrote themselves into history. They took action in a way that, quite frankly, we hadn't seen since the general strike in 1926. But I tell you, you had to be there to witness what happened. No film, no narrative can possibly convey what it felt like to miners who'd been not only on that picket line, but on picket lines in the East Anglia area, in London, all over the country. We'd been joined by miners from South Wales and Scotland and Kent, but we were still struggling, and we knew what was needed. When they began to come into Saltley area on 5 approach roads, I have never seen anything like it in my life. Everything I dreamed of as a young communist in the Young Communist League and in the Labour movement and as a trade unionist suddenly came together. They were coming to support us in our hour of need. The spirits of all those miners who were there, yes, they were lifted to a height I can't possibly begin to describe. As they walked in, led by women, I'll never forget how proud I felt. I heard the chief constable. I could go next to him. They were on the back foot. He said, when they come in, he's saying to his officers, make sure they go straight through and up the other road. And I jumped forward and said, we want you to stay here. And they did. Women stopped dead. They piled up. And as Alan Law said from the Transport and General Workers Union, in an article he wrote later, like a jam sandwich, they piled in. And the area was completely compacted. Speeches were being made, slogans were being shouted, general strike, Tories out. We had to take up a chant. And I began through this old battered megaphone to say, close the gates. And the theme was taken up, close the gates. And that mass of people, 20,000, every time they said, close the gates, they moved forward. And the police just went back physically. And we reached the point where, in the words of the Prime Minister, they were beaten. And they had no alternative but to lock the gates and then sign an agreement that only the coke earmarked for old age pensioners, those who were disabled and people in need would be permitted to go out of that coke depot. That's what you call not only class solidarity, but pride in the class to which you belong. I thought tonight, as I listened to the speeches from Paul, from Doug, and from Ian, if only those speeches had been the speeches in the general election from the Labour Party, calling for a withdrawal from the European Union and the establishment of a socialist policy. We wouldn't have had a Tory government, but we would have got out of the European Union. And we've got to learn the lessons that whatever form social democracy takes, it's not the way forward for socialists and those who believe in the need for an alternative system of society. I've got with me government papers produced by the secret services. Secret. You should read them. Prime Minister Callaghan said Scargill must be watched and warned and taken care of. That was a Labour Prime Minister. If today, and if tonight, we simply celebrate and commemorate the victory at Saltley Gate, we will be failing in our task. It's our responsibility as socialists, as people who want to see a different way of helping each other together, understanding the nature of what we're facing. We have to have a different approach. We have to begin to come together to rebuild the trade union movement. But it's got to be a trade union movement that understands that its leadership must reflect the feelings of those who are members of the unions. I pose the question to you rhetorically. How is it that workers throughout the north of England and the Midlands all voted to leave the European Union, and yet the trade union leaders were voting to stay in the European Union? It signifies that there's something not quite right in the communication between one and the other. But if you get that kind of support translated into action, you can overcome all obstacles. What we want to see arising out of the victory at Saltley is an understanding of what's needed in future. 1972 was a momentous year. We saw, for example, the Pentonville Five. 5 dockers sacked under the Industrial Relations Act. I spoke with Vic Turner, who was there, one of the Pentonville Five. They were jailed for conspiracy. And they were told there was no appeal. They'd gone through all of the features. The High Court, Court of Appeal, House of Lords. No way out. And he said, we had to consign ourselves to the fact that we would be in prison for a long time. And they said, the cell door opened and I was told I'd got to go to the warder's office. All 5 of us had. And when we got there, he said there was a man in funny breeches and a fluffy shirt and a staff, which he went. He said, on behalf of Her Majesty, in this the year of her reign, do cometh upon you, and from this day and this time insist that you are free to go. He said, the warder says, you can go. Vic says, hang on a minute. Who are you? He says, I am the official solicitor. He said, can we have you in future for our solicitor? He said, all those QCs couldn't get us out. The House of Lords, they couldn't get us out. And suddenly, you come along with your stick and we're out. He says, can I ask you, how many times have you done this job? He said, do you mean me, sir, or my predecessors? Vic said, what? Well, both. He said, well, sir, the past 500 years, this is the first time. Vic said to this meeting, I'll tell you what happened. It wasn't that there was some kind of law that they discovered. It wasn't the legislation or the eloquence of a superb barrister that freed them. It was the fact there were 2 million workers out on strike outside the prison. That's what got them freed in 1972. Just in the same way as it wasn't eloquence or speeches that won the victory at Saltley Gate. It was the action, the marvellous, heroic action of the people of Birmingham who took a decision to support a section of the working class under attack and came to their assistance. And as a result, that episode is echoed all over the world. It's taught in schools in other countries, but not here. But they're terrified that it will come again. But in the same year, we have the Shrewsbury 24. 24 of them arrested. 2 of them, Ricky Tomlinson and Des Warren, sent to jail for 5 years and 3 years for conspiracy. They'd done nothing wrong. And the movement didn't come to their assistance. And that, in my view, is a lesson for all of us to learn. I spoke with Ricky Tomlinson in preparation for a major meeting, and B, a television program. And it was interesting because there was a third man who they were charging with exactly the same offence that Warren and Tomlinson were facing. The barrister said, all you have to do is to plead guilty. He says, and what will happen? The judge will fine you £40. The union will pay you back. You'll have a warning and that'll be it. And he said to them, I'm not prepared to do it. I wasn't there. I didn't do it. He says, well, be it on your own head. He went into the witness box. The charge was read out, that on the day in question, you conspired with others at the said venue with the intent of destroying property that belonged to the employer. How do you plead? He said, not guilty. And I'll tell you something, I wasn't there. And I can prove it. He said, I was in the intensive care hospital, he said, in Wrexham. And I've got the document to show it. And the judge, most annoyed, said, why didn't you tell your barrister? He said, well, I'll tell you why. If I'd have told him, he'd have told the prosecution, he'd have told you, and I'd be facing another bloody charge. He said, well, it's a wrong that you were committed by not doing that. Case dismissed. It shouldn't happen again. But it demonstrated what they were doing. And to this day, Tomlinson and Des Warren, who's now dead, have never received a pardon, even though the prosecution barrister has admitted that the charges were wrong. And so we need to lead lessons. None more so than has been explained both by the speakers tonight and the events that took place in 1984. Because I was also at Orgreave and again arrested. And what happened at Orgreave was almost a replica of what happened at Saltley, with one major difference. We organised a mass picket to stop coke going out of a steel plant to a steel plant in the Yorkshire area. And quite frankly, there was nothing more justified than what we were doing. The British Steel Corporation had signed an agreement that there would be no coke taken from this depot at Orgreave, provided they would allow, that's the miners, sufficient coke simply to keep the steel ovens open. You need to keep them warm. We understood that. But of course, they didn't think the strike was going to go on. And they only had 8 weeks' supply. And so what they had to do then is to act in breach of an agreement they'd reached with strikers, and they intended to move thousands of tons of coke from this plant to the steelworks at Scunthorpe. And that's why we sent down 10,000 pickets to face 8,200 riot police, the most vicious I've ever seen in my life, armed to the teeth. Not only have they got horses and staves, they had truncheons, shields, army. There were a lot. They were charging indiscriminately into the crowds. And don't believe the stories that you read that miners were being kettled. They weren't. We had the high ground. And on the 18th of June, we also closed that plant. We closed it down. I got knocked unconscious in the process. And I urged from a hospital bed that the picketing, like we had at Saltley, should be increased. Unfortunately, and for reasons that I can't understand even to this day, the area leaderships in the NUM decided that they shouldn't continue with the picketing after the events on the 18th of June. I remain convinced to this day that had the picket continued, we would have achieved the same victory that we'd achieved at Saltley in 1972. More importantly, if you look at the history on YouTube, you'll hear senior police officers and government ministers of the time admitting that they couldn't have continued to defend the plant had the picket continued. That's a matter for the historians. All I can say is that what we did was the right thing at the right time. And I will never accept, by the way, that the 1984-5 miners' strike was a defeat. The greatest victory was the struggle itself, because it's more important that people are prepared to struggle, prepared to fight back and defend that which they have achieved or that which they want to achieve. Workers, for example, today in France, about which you hear nothing, but you hear everything about Hong Kong, or you hear everything about Venezuela. You'll hear slanted comments and reports about what's happening in Palestine, where a state like Israel is acting in a fascist way against the Palestinian people and deserve to be condemned. And the movement, I should say it openly. And yet, 28 miles away across the channel, French workers have cut off the electricity supply to government buildings, to suppliers, and they've diverted electricity to people who haven't got it. People who've had it cut off have had it restored. They've taken control. That's an example of working class solidarity, but also active opposition to that which is being perpetrated against them. It's a privilege to be here tonight. 48 years on, all my life, I've been committed as a socialist and a Marxist to an alternative. There's a program on television on YouTube. It's an interview with Ted Heath. And there's one point where he's asked a question. Why is it that you decided to go to the country in 1974? Why did you risk an election? He said, because there were those, he said, who intended, if they could, to bring down the government. And the interviewer says to him, how do you know that? He says, because they told me so. And he says, who did? And Ted Heath says, Mick McGahey and Arthur Scargill. They told me they wanted to overthrow the government. I'll tell you something else, shall I? If they were bloody dead right, I did want to overthrow the government that was attacking the miners who were only fighting for a decent wage, for a hard job done. In other words, I've had class consciousness from the day I can remember going to my first public meeting and hearing a woman speak eloquently about the world in which we live and the way in which we are lied to, misrepresented. And of course, arising from that experience, I witnessed personally, both in 1972 and probably far more important, in 1984 and 85, the emergence of the women's support groups, who were an inspiration not only here in Britain, but an inspiration on a world basis. They still talk about it, they still film it, they still make the records of it. And I'm proud that I was part of it. In Saltley in 1972, I was but one person who took part in a heroic struggle. The greatest struggle of my life in 1972 was when the workers of Birmingham, to their eternal credit, marched that day to join us on the picket line, and in doing so inflicted defeat on the ruling class and a victory to the working class. I was proud to be a socialist. I was proud of my class, and I'm still proud of the working class to which I belong. And I urge you, in future, learn the lesson and join together in reversing the trends that we've seen. Stop the tendency that we see to collaborate with the state, whether it be in the European Union, which thank God we've come out of, and begin the fight back, because they'll try to weaken all that we've achieved on that. But the trade union movement, properly organised, can do what no other section can do. They can combine, as you've seen, in country after country, and they can achieve victory. Just think about the ruling class in this country. They applaud, they cheer when workers in Poland or in Hungary or in the Soviet Union demonstrate on the streets. But they condemn the same workers in Britain if they go on the streets and struggle. That's because they hate the working class. And that's why we should detest the ruling class that only exploit us. Is it right in the year 2020 that we should be spending 100 billion on a nuclear program with nuclear submarines, which can only achieve, if ever fired, the annihilation of us all? It's stupidity at the worst possible way. How can we justify spending the money that we do on NATO, billions each year? On what? Who wants to occupy us? What we have to do is become, as I said before, internationalists as well as nationalists. And I am proud tonight to be saying I welcome the changes that have taken place in the Republic of Ireland. And I hope that that will lead to a unification of a nation that should never have been divided by the British state. I thank you for the invitation to speak tonight. I thank you for inviting me in 1972 to be amongst you in Birmingham, the point in time that has become history. And above all, I'm proud of the fact that throughout that period you have demonstrated in Birmingham that when the time came, you were ready to stand and fight and not give in. It's a privilege to be here.